10 years can change a person, but petty rivalries rarely die. They just wear more expensive clothes. Algernon thought he was walking into a simple college reunion to catch up with old friends. Instead, he stepped into a carefully orchestrated trap set by his ex-wife, designed to publicly destroy him. Defeated, he was ready to walk away in shame. Then, the most powerful billionaire in the city stepped through the double doors, hooked her arm through his, and smiled. "Honey, there you are." Morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of Algernon Turner's modest two-bedroom apartment, casting a warm golden glow over the scattered crayons and coloring books on the living room rug. Algernon, a 34-year-old single father, stood in the small kitchen, expertly flipping a blueberry pancake on the cast-iron skillet. At the small dining table sat his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, her legs kicking excitedly as she hummed a tune she had learned in kindergarten. For Algernon, this was the center of his universe. Every sacrifice, every late night, hunched over complex data models, and every skipped meal was for the little girl with messy brown pigtails and a smile that could melt the harshest winter. But this morning, there was a heavy pit in his stomach that no amount of morning domestic bliss could completely erase. Sitting on the edge of the kitchen counter was a thick, cream-colored envelope with gold foil lettering. It was the invitation to the Crestmont University 10-year alumni reunion. Normally, Algernon would have tossed it into the recycling bin without a second thought. He wasn't the same man he had been in college. Back then, he was the bright-eyed valedictorian of the business school, full of ambition, dating the reigning campus queen, Caelie Barrows. They had married shortly after graduation. It had seemed like the perfect picturesque life, a success story in the making. But reality had a cruel way of shattering perfect pictures. 5 years ago, when Lily was barely a year old, and Algernon was struggling to climb the corporate ladder while balancing fatherhood, Caelie had packed her designer bags and walked out. She hadn't left a note. She had left a divorce lawyer's business card on the kitchen island. She had found someone who didn't require her to wait for success. She had found Greg Higgins, a trust fund heir whose family owned a string of luxury car dealerships across the state. Caelie had not only left Algernon with a broken heart, but had also drained their joint savings, leaving him to rebuild his life from absolute scratch while raising a toddler alone. Algernon plated the pancakes, setting them in front of Lily with a forced smile. As she dug in, his phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. It was a text message from an unsaved number, but he knew the arrogant syntax instantly. "Heard through the grapevine you actually RSVP'd to the reunion tonight. Try to wear something decent. Algernon. Greg is wearing a custom Tom Ford suit. Don't embarrass yourself. See." Algernon closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady his rising heart rate. He had RSVP'd in a moment of defiance 2 weeks ago. He had wanted to prove to himself, and perhaps to the ghosts of his past, that he hadn't been destroyed. He had built a good, honest life. He was a senior data architect at Jackson Enterprises, one of the leading tech and logistics conglomerates in the country. It wasn't a flashy job, but it was respectable, and it provided for Lily. His boss was Vivian Jackson, the 32-year-old billionaire CEO who had taken over her father's empire and ruthlessly expanded it into a global powerhouse. Vivian was known in the corporate world as an ice queen, brilliant, demanding, and utterly uncompromising. Algernon respected her immensely. He often worked late, compiling risk assessment algorithms that he would leave on her desk. She rarely spoke to him beyond brief, sharp directives. But over the last year, she had begun requesting him specifically for high-level meetings. She valued competence, and Algernon was nothing if not meticulously competent. "Daddy, you're squeezing the spatula too hard," Lily pointed out, her mouth full of syrup. Algernon blinked, looking down at his white-knuckled grip on the plastic handle. He relaxed his hand and chuckled softly. "Sorry, sweetie. Just thinking about work." "Are you going to the big party tonight?" she asked, tilting her head. She knew he had hired Mrs. Higgins from down the hall to babysit. "I am," Algernon said, crouching down to her eye level. "Just for a little while. To say hello to some old friends." "You should wear your blue tie," Lily suggested solemnly. "You look like James Bond in the blue tie." Algernon smiled, kissing her forehead. "The blue tie it is." Later that evening, after tucking Lily into bed and giving Mrs. Higgins a list of emergency numbers she already had memorized, Algernon stood before his bathroom mirror. He adjusted the collar of his navy suit. It was off the rack, bought at a mid-tier department store, but he had it tailored to fit his broad shoulders and lean frame. He looked presentable. He looked like a man who had survived the fire and come out a little singed. But standing, he didn't want to win Caelie back. He didn't even want to confront her. He just wanted to walk into that room, have a drink, shake a few hands, and prove to the whispers that he was not a failure. He grabbed his keys, took one last look in the mirror, and headed out into the cool evening air. He had no idea he was walking straight into a meticulously prepared slaughter. The Grand Azure Hotel was the most opulent venue in the city, an architectural marvel of glass and imported Italian marble. The Alumni Association had clearly spared no expense for the 10-year mark, renting out the massive Starlight Ballroom. As Algernon handed his modest sedan's keys to the valet, who barely suppressed a wince at the sight of the worn upholstery, he felt the first true pang of imposter syndrome. He walked up the sweeping grand staircase, the muffled sounds of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal glasses growing louder with every step. Pushing open the heavy oak doors, he was hit by a wave of expensive perfumes, warm lighting, and the buzzing chatter of hundreds of people, desperately trying to prove they had made something of themselves. Algernon slipped in quietly, making a beeline for the open bar. He ordered a simple scotch on the rocks, hoping to fade into the background and observe. For the first 20 minutes, the strategy worked. He ran into Ben and Sarah, an old couple from his study group who had married and opened a modest veterinary clinic. They swapped pictures of their kids, and for a moment, Algernon felt a genuine sense of camaraderie and warmth. It felt normal. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't a sudden silence, but rather a ripple of turned heads and hushed murmurs that started near the entrance and spread like a wave across the ballroom floor. Algernon didn't need to turn around to know who had arrived, but he did anyway. Caelie made her entrance with the practiced grace of a pageant queen. She was wearing a breathtaking, floor-length crimson gown that practically screamed haute couture. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, catching the chandelier light like miniature flashbulbs. Beside her, looking incredibly smug, was Greg Higgins. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal tuxedo, his hair slicked back, a heavy gold Rolex peeking out from his cuff. They looked like they belonged on the cover of a wealthy lifestyle magazine. Algernon felt his chest tighten, but he forced his gaze away, taking a slow sip of his scotch. He turned back to Ben and Sarah, trying to resume their conversation about middle school zoning laws, but he could see their eyes darting nervously over his shoulder. Well, if it isn't Crestmont's former golden boy." The voice cut through the background noise like a finely honed blade. Algernon slowly turned around. Caelie was standing, less than 3 feet away, a flawless, predatory smile painted on her red lips. Greg stood right behind her, a cocktail in his hand and a look of supreme boredom on his face. "Hello, Caelie," Algernon said, keeping his voice even and polite. "It's good to see you. You look well." "I look expensive, Algernon. There's a difference," Caelie corrected, her eyes dragging up and down his off-the-rack suit with naked disdain. She let out a small, theatrical sigh. I must admit, when I saw your name on the RSVP list, I thought it was a clerical error. I didn't think this was really your scene anymore. A small crowd began to naturally form around them. College dynamics were kicking in. People smelled blood in the water, and human nature dictated they gather to watch the spectacle. It's an alumni event, Algernon said simply. I'm an alumnus. Right, Greg chimed in, stepping forward and clapping a heavy, patronizing hand on Algernon's shoulder. Algernon, isn't it? Caelie's told me all about you. Still crunching numbers in a cubicle somewhere, right? What was it? A junior analyst? Senior data architect, Algernon corrected quietly, gently shrugging Greg's heavy hand off his shoulder. At Jackson Enterprises. Greg let out a booming, fake laugh that echoed in the immediate area. Jackson, right. My company just bought a fleet of trucks from their logistics division. Maybe you process the paperwork. If you ever get tired of pushing pencils, let me know. Artie. I always have room for a junior inventory manager at one of my dealerships. The pay isn't great, but it beats whatever. This is. Greg waved a hand vaguely at Algernon's suit. A few people in the surrounding crowd snickered. Algernon felt a hot flush of humiliation creeping up his neck. He reminded himself of Lily. He reminded himself of the home he had built. He didn't need their validation. I'm quite happy where I am, Greg, but thank you for the offer, Algernon said, maintaining his composure. He looked at Caelie. If you'll excuse me, I need to get a refill. He tried to step past them, but Caelie shifted, blocking his path. She wasn't done. She had a captive audience, and she was determined to finish the execution. Don't run off so soon, Algernon, Caelie purred loudly, ensuring her voice carried over the string quartet. We were just talking about family. How is little Lily? It really is a tragedy she has to grow up in such a constrained environment. I suppose it's hard for a child to thrive without a real provider in the house, but I guess you're doing the best you can with your limited resources. The cruelty of bringing his daughter into this struck Algernon like a physical blow. The polite smiles of the onlookers vanished, replaced by awkward grimaces. But no one stepped in. The power dynamic was clear. Caelie and Greg were the wealthy elites. Algernon was the punching bag. Algernon's knuckles turned white around his glass. Lily is thriving, Caelie. No thanks to you. Caelie gasped in mock offense, pressing a hand to her diamond necklace. Oh, Algernon, don't be bitter. It's not my fault you couldn't keep up. I just realized I deserved a life of luxury. Not a life of counting coupons and living in a shoebox. You can't blame a woman for wanting a real man who can give her the world. The humiliation was complete. It was palpable, thick in the air. Algernon looked around the circle of faces. Some looked pitying, some looked amused. He suddenly felt incredibly tired. The defiance that had brought him here had completely evaporated, leaving only a profound sense of exhaustion. They had won. They always won because they operated without a conscience. A toast, Caelie announced suddenly, signaling a passing waiter for a fresh glass of champagne. She raised it high, turning to address the crowd that had now swollen to include a significant portion of the ballroom. A toast to the 10-year reunion, to those of us who climbed the ladder, who achieved our dreams. She paused, her eyes locking onto Algernon with a venomous glint. And a toast to those who are still exactly where we left them. May you one day find your footing, however small it may be. Greg laughed loudly, clinking his glass against hers. A few sycophants in the crowd followed suit, muttering half-hearted agreements. Algernon set his untouched scotch down on a passing tray. He had nothing left to prove to these people. He didn't need to subject himself to this masquerade for another second. He buttoned his jacket, squared his shoulders, and prepared to push past Greg and walk out of the ballroom, out of this toxic echo chamber, and back to the real world, where his daughter was waiting for him. He took a step forward. Suddenly, a sharp, commanding sound echoed from the front of the ballroom. It was the heavy brass handles of the main double doors being thrown open, with such force that they banged against the wall stops. The string quartet stumbled on their notes and ground to an awkward halt. The lively chatter of the room died instantly, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Standing in the entryway, flanked by two imposing security personnel in dark suits, was Vivian Jackson. She looked absolutely breathtaking, radiating an aura of absolute power and undeniable elegance. She was wearing a meticulously tailored, midnight black velvet suit with a plunging neckline, the sharp lines of the blazer accentuating her formidable posture. Her dark hair was slicked back into a severe but stunning chignon, and her piercing, ice-blue eyes swept over the room like a hawk surveying a field of field mice. She wasn't just wealthy. She was the kind of wealthy that bought and sold men like Greg Higgins before her morning coffee. Algernon froze, utterly bewildered. What on earth was the CEO of his company doing at the Crestmont University reunion? She hadn't gone to school here. She had graduated from Ivy League institutions a decade ahead of her peers. The crowd parted in absolute silence as Vivian stepped into the room. People scrambled to get out of her way, their faces a mixture of awe, intimidation, and sheer confusion. She ignored all of them. Her sharp gaze scanned the crowd, dismissing faces in fractions of a second, until her eyes locked onto Algernon. A subtle, almost imperceptible softening crossed her features. She began to walk toward him. The click of her stiletto heels on the polished marble floor echoed in the dead-silent ballroom. She glided through the parted sea of alumni, walking straight toward the tense circle where Algernon, Caelie, and Greg stood. Greg puffed out his chest, clearly recognizing the billionaire. He hastily smoothed his lapels, putting on his most charming, sycophantic smile, preparing to introduce himself, likely thinking she had come to finalize some massive fleet deal with his family's company. "Ms. Jackson," Greg said loudly, stepping forward and extending his hand as she approached. "What an absolute honor. I'm Greg Higgins. We recently did business." Vivian didn't even look at him. She walked past his extended hand as if he were a particularly uninteresting piece of furniture. She stepped directly into Algernon's personal space. The scent of her expensive, subtle, jasmine perfume washed over him. Before Algernon could stammer out a greeting or ask what was going on, Vivian reached out, sliding her perfectly manicured hand down his arm and smoothly hooking it through his. She stepped close, pressing her side against him, creating a picture of undeniable, effortless intimacy. She looked up at Algernon, her ice-blue eyes sparkling with a warmth he had never, ever seen in the boardroom, and offered a soft, dazzling smile that could have brought empires to their knees. "Honey," Vivian said, her voice rich, melodic, and carrying perfectly into the silence of the room. "I've been looking everywhere for you. You promised you wouldn't leave me alone with the board members at the charity gala upstairs. It's absolutely dreadful without you." A collective gasp rippled through the immediate crowd. Someone dropped a glass, it shattered on the floor. But nobody looked away. Algernon's heart stopped, his brain short-circuited. "Honey?" He stared down at his notoriously ruthless boss, his mouth slightly open. He felt her fingers subtly tighten on his bicep. A silent command. "Play along." I'm sorry, Algernon managed to say, his voice surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline roaring in his ears. I just got caught up catching up with old acquaintances. Vivian turned her head smoothly, her gaze falling upon Caelie and Greg. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced instantly by the terrifying, sub-zero appraisal that made Fortune 500 CEOs sweat through their shirts. Oh, Vivian murmured, looking Caelie up and down with agonizing slowness. She took in the crimson gown, the diamonds, the desperate need for attention, and dismissed it all with a microscopic tilt of her chin. I see. Caelie's jaw had practically unhinged. The smug, victorious flush had completely drained from her face, leaving her pale beneath her expensive makeup. She stared at Vivian's hand wrapped possessively around Algernon's arm, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. You! Caelie stammered, completely losing her refined composure. You're Vivian Jackson. I am, Vivian replied smoothly, her voice a dangerous purr. And you must be… Actually, Algernon has never mentioned you. Not once. The insult was quiet, elegant, and utterly devastating. It was a sniper shot compared to Caelie's earlier shotgun blast of insults. It told Caelie exactly what she was, entirely insignificant to Algernon's current life. Greg, realizing he had just spent the last 10 minutes publicly mocking a man apparently dating a woman whose company could buy his entire family's legacy with petty cash, began to visibly sweat. We used to be married, Caelie blurted out, desperation making her voice shrill. I'm Caelie, his ex-wife. Ah, Vivian said, drawing the syllable out. The starter wife. She leaned slightly closer to Algernon, resting her head lightly against his shoulder, in a display of absolute ownership. Well, Caelie, I suppose I should thank you. If you hadn't been so remarkably foolish in letting him go, I might never have found him. Vivian smiled, but it was a smile, devoid of any mercy. The power dynamic in the room hadn't just shifted. It had been entirely demolished and rebuilt in Vivian's image. And Algernon, standing in the center of the wreckage, realized the night had just taken a turn he could never have predicted in a million years. Silence hung in the starlight ballroom, thick and suffocating. The string quartet remained frozen, bows hovering uselessly over their instruments. Dozens of eyes bounced like ping-pong balls between Vivian Jackson's serene, commanding expression and Caelie's rapidly crumbling facade. Greg Higgins, sensing the imminent collapse of his social standing and potentially his family's lucrative logistics contracts, attempted a desperate pivot. He forced a strained, sweaty laugh, clapping his hands together. Well, Ms. Jackson, I must say, Algernon is a lucky man. We were just catching up, old friends, you know, joking around. Vivian slowly turned her gaze to Greg. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Joking, she repeated, the word sounding like a death sentence slipping from her perfectly painted lips. Fascinating. I must have missed the humor in mocking a man's livelihood and his child. My apologies. Mr. Higgins, I clearly lack your refined comedic palate. Greg swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight tuxedo collar. It was just a misunderstanding, ma'am. Truly, I don't do misunderstandings, Vivian said softly. She tilted her head, her eyes drilling into Greg's soul. And I certainly do not do business with men who lack basic professional decorum. I believe your father, Walter, has a meeting scheduled with my acquisition team next Tuesday regarding the renewal of the regional transport leases. I think I'll be attending that meeting personally now. Greg turned the color of old parchment. The Higgins family fortune relied heavily on those Jackson Enterprise leases. With one sentence, Vivian hadn't just humiliated him. She had threatened his entire inheritance. Caelie, grasping desperately for any shred of the dominance she had wielded 5 minutes ago, sneered. "This is ridiculous. You expect us to believe that a billionaire CEO is dating a mid-level data cruncher? It's pathetic. Algernon, paying your boss to bail you out of a reunion." Vivian let out a soft, melodious laugh that made Caelie flinch. "Jealousy is such an ugly color on you, Caelie. It clashes terribly with the crimson." Vivian turned her back on the couple, dismissing them completely. She looked up at Algernon, her expression softening once more into that terrifyingly convincing facade of affection. "Shall we go, darling? The air in here has become remarkably stale." "Yes," Algernon managed to say, his vocal cords finally remembering how to function. "Let's go." Vivian kept her arm looped securely through his as they walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, alumni practically flattening themselves against the buffet tables to avoid getting in Vivian's way. Algernon felt a bizarre mix of adrenaline and profound disorientation. He was acutely aware of the warmth of Vivian's side pressed against his, the gentle grip of her fingers on his sleeve, and the stunned whispers trailing in their wake. They moved through the heavy oak doors, past the bewildered registration desk, and out into the cool night air of the Grand Azure Hotel's private driveway. A sleek, midnight black Mercedes Maybach S-Class was idling by the curb, 2 formidable security guards standing at attention near the rear doors. As soon as the hotel doors closed behind them, the palpable tension radiating from Vivian vanished, replaced by a crisp, businesslike efficiency. She smoothly unhooked her arm from his, stepping back to a polite professional distance. "You can breathe now, Mr. Turner," Vivian said, her tone devoid of the honeyed warmth she had weaponized inside. Algernon exhaled a long, shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "Ms. Jackson, I don't even know what to say. Thank you, I suppose. But what on earth are you doing here, and why did you—" He gestured vaguely toward the hotel entrance. "Get in the car, Algernon," Vivian instructed, gesturing to the open door of the Maybach. "We have a great deal to discuss, and I prefer not to do it on a public sidewalk." Algernon hesitated for a fraction of a second, thinking of Lily and the babysitter waiting at home. But curiosity, and a deep-seated respect for the woman who had just saved him from absolute social ruin, won out. He climbed into the plush, leather-lined interior of the luxury vehicle. Vivian slid in beside him, tapping the privacy glass partition that separated them from the driver. The car pulled seamlessly away from the curb, merging into the glowing arteries of downtown traffic. Inside the cabin, the silence stretched for several blocks. Algernon watched the city lights wash over Vivian's sharp profile. She was staring out the window, her mind clearly running complex calculations. "I was attending the St. Jude's Charity Gala in the rooftop ballroom," Vivian finally said, breaking the silence without turning her head. It was excruciatingly dull, a room full of aging corporate vultures trying to network under the guise of philanthropy. I stepped out to take a call from my head of security. He mentioned there was a college reunion happening in the Starlight Room, and that one of my senior architects was currently being publicly cornered by a rather loud group of people. Algernon winced, looking down at his hands. "I apologize if it reflected poorly on Jackson Enterprises." Vivian turned to look at him, her icy blue eyes unreadable in the dim light. "It didn't reflect on the company, Algernon. It reflected on you. Why did you just stand there and let them attempt to humiliate you? Because fighting with people like Caelie and Greg is like wrestling a pig in the mud. Algernon said quietly. You both get dirty, but the pig likes it. I didn't want a scene. I just wanted to leave. Noble, but ineffective, Vivian noted smoothly. In the corporate world, and in life, if you do not define your own narrative, your enemies will gladly define it for you. Is that why you intervened? Algernon asked, genuinely confused. To teach me a lesson in public relations. Vivian reached over to a small, polished wood compartment between the seats, retrieving a crystal decanter and 2 heavy tumblers. She poured a small measure of amber liquid into each, handing one to Algernon. I intervened, Vivian said, taking a delicate sip of her Macallan 25, because I never pass up an opportunity. I saved you from a rather pathetic social execution, Mr. Turner, and in return I am going to need a favor. A very large, very complicated favor. Algernon stared at the incredibly expensive scotch in his hand, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. With Vivian Jackson, nothing was ever free. What kind of favor? The Maybach glided smoothly into the subterranean VIP parking garage of the Jackson Enterprises headquarters. Algernon followed Vivian into a private glass elevator that shot silently up to the top floor. The doors opened directly into her sprawling penthouse office, a masterpiece of modern design with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. Vivian walked over to her massive mahogany desk, dropping her small clutch onto the polished surface. She gestured for Algernon to take a seat on the sleek leather sofa in the center of the room. Let me be entirely transparent with you. Algernon, Vivian began, pacing slowly in front of the windows. For the past 6 months, I have been fighting a shadow war within my own board of directors. A faction led by Richard Harrington is attempting to orchestrate a vote of no confidence to push me out of the CEO position. Algernon frowned, setting his glass down on the glass coffee table. Harrington? He's the head of the International Acquisitions Committee. Why would he want you out? The company's profits are up 20% this quarter alone. Because he is old money, and he is a traditionalist, Vivian said, her voice laced with quiet contempt. He believes that a 32-year-old unmarried woman is too unstable to manage a multi-billion-dollar empire long-term. He has been aggressively pushing for me to marry his nephew, a complete imbecile who currently manages a hedge fund into the ground. Harrington wants a merger of families to secure his power base. He claims it would project stability to our international shareholders. Algernon leaned back, trying to process the sheer scale of the boardroom politics. And if you refuse? If I refuse, he leverages his faction to force a leadership review, Vivian explained. Which I might win, but it would cause a public media circus that would tank our stock price for a year. I need a countermove. I need to project stability on my own terms. I need a partner who completely nullifies Harrington's argument. Algernon's eyes widened as the pieces abruptly clicked together. He remembered her hand slipping through his arm. The word, honey, ringing out in the quiet ballroom. You can't be serious. Me. Vivian stopped pacing and looked directly at him. Yes, you. I need a fiancé. Algernon. Someone respectable, grounded, and entirely immune to the temptations of the elite social circles Harrington operates in. You are a senior data architect, a single father, a man who has clearly built a life of quiet responsibility. You are the absolute antithesis of the reckless, playboy, billionaire narrative Harrington tries to paint me with. This is insane, Algernon said flatly, standing up from the sofa. Ms. Jackson, you're talking about faking an engagement to fool a board of directors. That's corporate fraud. It's a soap opera. It is a strategic alliance, Vivian corrected, unfazed by his outburst. And it will be fraud, because we will sign a legally binding cohabitation agreement. It will last exactly 1 year. Long enough for me to crush Harrington's faction, solidify my voting bloc, and transition him out of the company entirely. After that, we announce an amicable separation. Algernon shook his head, running his hands over his face. No, absolutely not. I have a 6-year-old daughter, Vivian. Lily is my entire world. I am not dragging her into a fake relationship with a billionaire just to play boardroom chess. She needs stability, not a temporary stepmother who vanishes in 12 months. For the first time all evening, the icy, calculated mask Vivian wore seemed to slip. She looked down, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. When she looked back up, the ruthless CEO was gone, replaced by something entirely different. I know, Vivian said softly. I know about Lily. I reviewed your complete personnel file 3 weeks ago when I started formulating this contingency plan. I know you struggled after your divorce. I know you pay exorbitant out-of-pocket costs for her speech therapy because our standard corporate insurance only covers a fraction of it. Algernon stiffened, a protective anger flaring in his chest. You looked into my daughter's medical records. I am thorough, Vivian said, meeting his gaze steadily. And because I am thorough, I am offering you compensation that matches the magnitude of what I am asking. If you agree to this, your salary will be tripled immediately, retroactively applied to the beginning of the fiscal year. You will be promoted to Director of Data Analytics. But more importantly, I will establish an irrevocable trust fund for Lily. $5 million, managed by an independent fiduciary, accessible when she turns 18. I will also personally guarantee her admission and full tuition into the Brighton Academy. Algernon's breath hitched. Brighton Academy was the most elite private school in the state. Impossible to get into without massive generational wealth or extraordinary political connections. And $5 million. That was absolute, generational security. It meant Lily would never have to worry about college, a mortgage, or starting a business. It meant she would never have to struggle the way he had. I am not asking you to neglect your daughter, Vivian continued, her voice remarkably gentle. I am asking you to secure her future. I will not interfere in your parenting. When it is just the 3 of us behind closed doors, we can be exactly what we are, colleagues and roommates. But in public, at corporate events, and when the paparazzi are looking, you will be my devoted partner. Algernon looked at Vivian, really looked at her, beneath the velvet suit and the terrifying reputation. He saw a woman backed into a corner, fighting desperately to protect the legacy her father had built. She wasn't just using him, she was asking for help in the only language she knew, contracts and compensation. Why me? Really? Algernon asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. You could have hired an actor, someone professional. Vivian walked back over to her desk, leaning against the edge and crossing her arms. Because I saw how you handled yourself tonight, before I intervened. You were publicly attacked by a woman who shattered your life, and a man who represents everything you lost. You didn't scream, you didn't throw a punch. You stood your ground to protect your dignity. I don't need a professional actor, Algernon. I need a good man, and they are exceptionally rare in my world. Algernon looked out the window at the glittering city below. He thought of the tight budget he kept on a spreadsheet on his laptop. He thought of Lily's worn-out sneakers and the small apartment. Then he thought of Caelie's mocking voice, echoing in the ballroom. I suppose it's hard for a child to thrive without a real provider. He turned back to Vivian, his jaw set in a firm line. 1 year. 1 year, Vivian confirmed, a flicker of genuine relief passing through her ice-blue eyes. And Lily is completely off-limits to the press. If Harrington or anyone else tries to drag her into the mud, the deal is off, and I walk." "Agreed," Vivian said. She reached into her desk drawer, pulling out a thick, leather-bound folder, and slid it across the mahogany surface, toward him. "The contract has already been drafted by my personal legal team. Take it home. Read it thoroughly. If you agree, sign it, and bring it to my office on Monday." Algernon picked up the heavy folder, feeling the immense weight of the decision resting in his hands. His simple, quiet life was officially over. As he walked toward the private elevator to leave, Vivian called out softly from behind him. "Algernon?" He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Thank you," she said. Algernon gave a stiff nod and stepped into the elevator. He didn't know if he had just made the best decision of his life for his daughter, or if he had just sold his soul to the devil in a velvet suit. But as the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, he knew one thing for certain. Caelie and Greg's reaction to his sudden ascension was going to be absolutely spectacular. The weekend passed in a blur of legal jargon and profound soul-searching. Algernon read the 50-page cohabitation and non-disclosure agreement 3 times over. It was ironclad, cold, and meticulously detailed, outlining everything from public appearances to living arrangements. Vivian was offering him the penthouse suite in her luxury building, a dedicated nanny, and the $5 million trust for Lily. On Sunday night, after watching his daughter sleep peacefully in her cramped room, Algernon signed his name on the dotted line. On Monday morning, the world shifted on its axis. Before the official press release was scheduled to hit the financial networks at noon, Vivian insisted on a private meeting with Lily. She didn't want the child blindsided by paparazzi or sudden changes. At 9 in the morning, the black Maybach pulled up to Algernon's modest apartment complex. When Algernon opened the door, Vivian stood in the hallway, looking completely out of place against the peeling paint of the corridor. She wore a tailored beige trench coat over a simple white silk blouse and wide-leg trousers, her hair loose around her shoulders. She held a beautifully wrapped, rectangular box. "Come in," Algernon said, stepping aside. He felt a sudden, irrational wave of embarrassment over his scuffed linoleum floors and the mismatched furniture. But Vivian didn't even glance at the decor. Her eyes immediately found Lily, who was sitting at the kitchen table, meticulously coloring a picture of a dragon. Lily looked up, her big brown eyes widening at the stunning woman standing in their living room. "Lily, sweetie," Algernon said, walking over and resting a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "This is my boss, Vivian, and my friend." Vivian approached slowly, her usual intimidating aura entirely subdued. To Algernon's surprise, she didn't stand over the child. Instead, she knelt directly onto the cheap rug, bringing herself down to Lily's eye level, heedless of what the floor might do to her designer trousers. "Hello, Lily," Vivian said, her voice softer than Algernon had ever heard it. "Your father has told me a great deal about you." Lily tilted her head, inspecting Vivian with the unfiltered scrutiny only a 6-year-old possesses. "You look like a queen from my storybooks. Are you a queen?" A tiny, genuine smile broke through Vivian's composed expression. "No, not a queen. I just run a very large company. But I brought you a gift, if you'd like to open it." She offered the wrapped box. Lily looked at Algernon for permission. He nodded. Lily eagerly tore the paper away to reveal a vintage, beautifully crafted wooden art set, complete with professional-grade watercolors, sketching pencils, and thick parchment paper. It wasn't a generic toy. It was a thoughtful acknowledgement of the drawings Algernon kept pinned to his cubicle wall. "Whoa!" Lily breathed, running her small fingers over the smooth wood. "Thank you, Miss Vivian." "You are very welcome," Vivian said, standing back up. She met Algernon's eyes over Lily's head, and in that brief, silent exchange, a foundation of mutual respect was cemented. She wasn't just playing a part. She was honoring the gravity of entering his child's life. By noon, the press release hit the wire. Billionaire CEO Vivian Jackson announces engagement to Jackson Enterprises executive Algernon Turner. When Algernon walked into the corporate headquarters after lunch, the atmosphere was electric. The lobby fell dead silent as he swiped his badge. Security guards stood a little straighter. Executives who usually ignored him suddenly offered deferential nods. He wasn't just the data architect anymore. He was the future husband of the undisputed ruler of their corporate empire. Up on the executive floor, the fallout was instantaneous. Algernon stepped out of the elevator, just as the doors to the main boardroom swung open. Richard Harrington, a silver-haired man in a bespoke pinstripe suit, stormed out, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He spotted Algernon and stopped dead in his tracks. "Turner!" Harrington sneered, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. I don't know what kind of blackmail you have on her, or what ridiculous game Vivian is playing. But this charade won't last. She's trying to secure her seat, and she's using you as a prop. When the board sees through this, you'll both be out on the street. Before Algernon could respond, Vivian's voice sliced through the corridor, sharp as a guillotine. "Richard," Vivian stood in the doorway of her office, her posture radiating absolute authority. "I suggest you watch your tone when speaking to my fiancé. And if you have grievances regarding my personal life, you can air them at the quarterly review. Until then, you will treat Algernon with the exact same respect you are contractually obligated to show me. Is that understood?" Harrington's jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter. He glared at Algernon, then at Vivian, before turning on his heel and marching toward the elevators without another word. Vivian looked at Algernon, gesturing for him to enter her office. As the heavy doors clicked shut behind them, she let out a sharp breath. Step 1 is complete. The board is thoroughly destabilized. Now, we tighten the noose, while Algernon was stepping into a new world of wealth and power. Caelie's world was rapidly collapsing, 30 miles away. In the sprawling, gated estate of the Higgins family, the air was thick with panic. Greg Higgins stood in his father's opulent study, sweating profusely into his polo shirt. Walter Higgins, a red-faced, barrel-chested patriarch who had built his logistics empire through sheer ruthlessness, threw a heavy crystal tumbler against the fireplace. It shattered into 100 pieces. "You stupid, arrogant boy!" Walter roared, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. Do you have any idea what you've done? I just got off the phone with Jackson's acquisitions director. Our lease renewals have been indefinitely suspended pending CEO review. Greg swallowed hard, taking a step back. "Dad, I didn't know. How was I supposed to know Algernon was with Vivian Jackson? He's a nobody. It has to be a stunt. He's conning her." "I don't care if he's performing witchcraft on her," Walter bellowed, slamming his fists onto his desk. "She is Vivian Jackson. She holds the contracts that keep 40% of our fleet on the road. If she pulls our leases, our stock plummets. The board revolts, and we lose everything. Because you and that vapid trophy wife of yours couldn't resist playing high school bullies at a reunion." Caelie sat frozen on a leather Chesterfield sofa in the corner, her face pale. The extravagant lifestyle she had sacrificed her marriage and her daughter for was suddenly teetering on the edge of a cliff, and it was all because of the man she had discarded. "I'll fix it, Dad," Greg stammered, his bravado completely shattered. "I'll call Jackson Enterprises. I'll grovel. I'll do whatever it takes." "You're damn right you will." Walter snarled. "And you," he snapped, pointing a thick finger at Caelie. "You're going to fix this with your ex-husband. I don't care what you have to say to him. Cry, beg, apologize. You make this right. Or you and Greg will find yourselves cut out of my will by Friday." Driven by desperation and absolute panic, Caelie drove her Mercedes SUV straight to the Jackson Enterprises tower the following morning. She bypassed the standard visitor protocol, using a mix of tears and aggressive entitlement to force the lobby receptionist to call up to Algernon's department. Algernon had just settled into his newly upgraded corner office, a massive, sunlit space that dwarfed his old cubicle, when his desk phone rang. It was security. "Mr. Turner, your ex-wife is in the lobby. She is causing quite a scene and demanding to speak with you. Should I have her escorted off the premises?" Algernon sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew this was coming. He could have let security throw her out, but that would only delay the inevitable. "No, I'll come down. Keep her near the front desk." When Algernon stepped off the elevator into the cavernous glass lobby, Caelie rushed toward him. She looked frazzled. The perfect, untouchable aura she had worn at the reunion was completely shattered. "Algernon, thank God," Caelie said, reaching out to grab his arm. Algernon smoothly stepped back, his expression entirely unreadable. "What do you want, Caelie?" "Algernon, please, we need to talk," she pleaded, her voice echoing slightly in the large space. Several employees walking past openly stared at the scene. "This whole thing with you and Vivian Jackson. I know you're doing this to get back at me. I know you're angry about how I left, but you can't ruin Greg's family over this. Please, just tell her to back off the Higgins contracts." Algernon looked at the woman he had once loved, the woman who had broken his heart and abandoned their child, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no lingering affection, just a profound, hollow pity. "You think this is about you?" Algernon asked, his voice low and incredibly calm. Caelie blinked, momentarily thrown off by his complete lack of emotion. "Of course it is. You show up at the reunion, then suddenly you're engaged to the billionaire CEO who is actively destroying my husband's company. It's revenge, Algernon, and I get it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I said at the reunion. I'm sorry I left. Just, please. We have history. We have Lily." The mention of his daughter's name ignited a cold fury in Algernon's chest. He took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance, forcing Caelie to shrink back. "Do not ever invoke Lily's name to save your own skin," Algernon said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "You lost the right to say her name the day you walked out without a backward glance. My life, my engagement to Vivian, and my future have absolutely nothing to do with you. Caelie, you flatter yourself to think you warrant that kind of effort." Caelie's eyes filled with tears, realizing her charms, her apologies, and her manipulations were bouncing off an impenetrable wall. "Algernon, please, if she pulls those contracts, Greg's father is going to cut us off. We'll lose the house. We'll lose everything. Then you will finally know what it feels like to start from the bottom," Algernon replied coldly. "You wanted a man who could give you the world, Caelie. It looks like you picked the wrong one." He turned his back on her, walking steadily toward the private executive elevators. "Algernon!" Caelie screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria, completely abandoning her dignity in front of a dozen Jackson employees. "You can't do this! You owe me!" Algernon didn't turn around. He swiped his badge, stepped into the elevator, and let the steel doors slide shut, cutting off the sound of her voice forever. He had survived the fire she had started 5 years ago. Now, it was her turn to burn. As the months rolled on, the performance of their engagement blurred with reality. Algernon and Lily moved into Vivian's sprawling, multi-level penthouse overlooking the city. At first, it was a polite, strictly choreographed existence. Vivian had her wing, Algernon and Lily had theirs. But the sterile, silent emptiness of Vivian's life was quickly dismantled by the chaotic warmth of a 6-year-old child. Within weeks, high-level corporate blueprints on the kitchen island were replaced by finger paintings. Vivian, who normally spent her evenings ruthlessly negotiating with European conglomerates, found herself sitting on the plush living room floor, helping Lily assemble a ridiculously complicated Lego castle. Algernon would watch them from the kitchen, brewing chamomile tea, feeling an unexpected tightness in his chest. Vivian wasn't an ice queen. She was a woman who had simply been forced to build a fortress to survive the brutal world of corporate warfare. With Lily, the drawbridge came down. With Algernon, the walls were slowly crumbling. But outside the penthouse, the shadow war was reaching its climax. Richard Harrington had not surrendered. He was too proud, too steeped in old money entitlement, to let a self-made upstart and a data architect steal his anticipated throne. Desperate to expose the engagement as a sham, Harrington hired an elite team of private investigators to shadow Vivian and Algernon's every move. The culmination of Harrington's plot arrived in late November, during the annual Global Innovators Gala, held at the Plaza Hotel in New York. It was the most exclusive, corporate event of the year. A room packed with real-world titans. Executives from Goldman Sachs rubbed shoulders with tech moguls, and journalists from Forbes and the Wall Street Journal prowled the floor for scoops. It was the perfect stage for a public execution. Vivian looked ethereal in a custom, shimmering emerald gown, while Algernon wore a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that made his broad shoulders look carved from granite. They moved through the ballroom with practiced grace, a unified front of power and elegance. Just as the keynote speeches concluded and the string orchestra swelled, Harrington made his move. He approached their table, flanked by 3 influential board members and a prominent financial journalist he had clearly tipped off. "Vivian," Harrington said, his voice loud enough to cut through the surrounding chatter and draw the attention of nearby tables. "And Algernon, what a spectacular performance you both put on tonight. Truly, Broadway-worthy." Vivian slowly set down her champagne flute. "Richard, I see you brought an audience. To what do we owe this intrusion?" "The truth," Harrington sneered, pulling a thick, folded manila envelope from his breast pocket. He tossed it onto the pristine white tablecloth in front of them. "I know it's a fake. The entire engagement. I had my security team intercept communications from your private legal counsel. Inside that envelope is a drafted cohabitation agreement, a contract. Vivian, you bought yourself a fiancé to secure the board vote." The surrounding executives fell silent. The journalist's eyes widened, a digital recorder already discreetly in hand. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. If this was proven true right now, the scandal would rock Jackson Enterprises' stock by morning, and Vivian would be forced to resign in disgrace. Algernon felt his stomach drop, but before he could react, Vivian simply smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. "Go ahead, Richard," Vivian said calmly, leaning back in her chair. "Open it. Read it to the room, if you are so confident in your corporate espionage. Let's hear the terms." Harrington scoffed, snatching the envelope and tearing it open. He pulled out the sheaf of papers, his eyes scanning the first page. Suddenly, the smug, victorious grin on his face faltered. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his face draining of color. "What is this?" Harrington whispered, his voice trembling. "That," Vivian said, her voice echoing clearly in the quiet ballroom, "is the drafted acquisition contract for Higgins Logistics, a company you, Richard, heavily invested your personal shadow funds into, violating our corporate non-compete clauses. I knew your investigators were tailing us. I knew they were tapping my lawyer's secondary servers. So, I left them a little present to find." The board members standing behind Harrington gasped, stepping away from him as if he had suddenly caught a contagious disease. Insider trading and violating a non-compete were offenses that wouldn't just get him fired. They could land him in federal prison. "You set me up," Harrington hissed, dropping the papers onto the table as if they were burning his hands. "I protected my company from a parasite," Vivian corrected coldly. "Security will escort you out of the plaza. Richard, my legal team will see you on Monday to discuss the immediate surrender of your shares and your early retirement." Harrington stood frozen, utterly destroyed in front of the most powerful people in the country. He turned and fled the ballroom, a broken man. The immediate silence was deafening, but Algernon didn't care about the board members or the journalists. He looked at Vivian. Her hands were trembling slightly beneath the table. The adrenaline was crashing. She had risked her entire empire on a high-stakes bluff, and she had won. Algernon didn't think about the cameras, the contract, or the boundaries they had set. He reached out, taking her trembling hand in his, pulling her gently toward him. Vivian looked up, her icy eyes wide and vulnerable. "You were brilliant," Algernon murmured. And then, right in the middle of the ballroom, under the glittering chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel. Algernon kissed her. It wasn't the polite, staged pecks they had shared for the paparazzi. It was deep, anchoring, and fiercely real. Vivian gasped softly against his lips before melting into the embrace, her hands reaching up to grip the lapels of his tuxedo. The flashbulbs from the press went off like lightning storms, capturing the undeniable, blazing truth of their connection. The shadow war was over. The real story had just begun. 11 months into the 12-month contract, the world looked entirely different. Without the Higgins Logistics contracts, Walter Higgins's empire had crumbled under a mountain of leveraged debt. The company was absorbed in a hostile takeover by a rival firm. Greg, stripped of his trust fund and his arrogance, was reportedly working a mid-level regional sales job, barely scraping by. Caelie, true to her nature, had abandoned ship the moment the luxury cars were repossessed. She was currently living in a cramped studio apartment on the wrong side of the city, working as a receptionist and bitterly scrolling through articles about her billionaire fiancé ex-husband. But inside the penthouse, a different kind of crisis was brewing. The contract was expiring in exactly 3 weeks. The danger had passed. Harrington was gone. The board was fiercely loyal to Vivian, and Jackson Enterprises was experiencing record-breaking profits. By all logical metrics, the mission was accomplished. It was time for the amicable separation. Algernon sat in his home office, staring blankly at the glowing screen of his laptop. His bags were partially packed in the closet. The $5 million trust had cleared into Lily's accounts months ago. He was vastly wealthy now, promoted to vice president of analytics, and respected by his peers. He had everything he had ever wanted, except the one thing he suddenly realized he couldn't live without. Vivian. She had grown distant over the last week, throwing herself back into her work, arriving home long after Lily was asleep, and leaving before breakfast. Algernon assumed she was preparing for the separation. neatly compartmentalizing her emotions as she always did with completed mergers. It broke his heart, but he had promised to play by her rules. That evening, Algernon was sitting on the living room floor, reading a bedtime story to Lily, when the front doors of the penthouse clicked open. Vivian walked in, dropping her briefcase onto the marble foyer. She looked exhausted, her usual immaculate armor showing cracks of deep fatigue. "Miss Vivian!" Lily cheered, scrambling up from the floor and running toward her. Vivian dropped to her knees, catching the little girl in a tight, desperate hug. She buried her face in Lily's shoulder for a long moment, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo. Algernon watched from the living room, feeling a heavy lump form in his throat. "I have to go to bed now," Lily announced importantly, pulling back. "Daddy is finishing the dragon story, but I know the dragon wins. Good night, Miss Vivian." "Good night, my sweet girl," Vivian whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears, after Lily padded off to her room. Algernon stood up, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Long day?" Vivian stood slowly, refusing to meet his eyes. "Yes, the European merger requires my attention. I spoke with the lawyers today. Algernon, about the termination clauses of the cohabitation agreement. They have the press release drafted for the end of the month. We can frame it as a mutual drifting apart due to demanding schedules." Algernon felt the air leave his lungs. "Right, the press release." He swallowed hard. "Is that what you want, Vivian? A press release?" Vivian finally looked at him, and for the first time since they had met, she looked completely terrified. "It's what we agreed to. You protected me. You gave me the stability I needed, and I compensated you. The transaction is complete." "Transaction," Algernon repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He crossed the room, closing the distance between them until he was standing inches away from her. "Is that what it was when you helped Lily build that Lego castle for 3 hours? Is that what it was when we kissed at the plaza? Just business?" Vivian crossed her arms defensively, stepping back. "Algernon, don't, please. I am not built for this. I build companies. I manage assets. I don't know how to do this. I ruin things when I let them get too close." "You haven't ruined anything," Algernon said fiercely. He reached out, gently taking her arms and unfolding them, lacing his fingers through hers. "You saved me, Vivian, and not just from Caelie at that stupid reunion. You saved me from a life of just surviving. You brought light back into my daughter's eyes. You brought light back into mine." A single tear slipped down Vivian's cheek, shattering the Ice Queen facade forever. "Algernon." "I read the contract," Algernon said softly, reaching into his pocket. "It says the agreement terminates upon the completion of 12 months, or upon the mutual dissolution of the terms by both parties." Algernon took a step back, slowly, deliberately, dropped to one knee on the marble floor. Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Algernon pulled a small, velvet box from his pocket and popped it open. Inside wasn't a massive, gaudy diamond bought by a corporate shadow fund. It was a beautiful, elegant sapphire ring he had picked out himself, paid for with the salary he had earned. "Let's void the contract, Vivian," Algernon said, looking up at her with absolute certainty. "I don't want a fake engagement, and I don't want an amicable separation. I want you, for real, for the rest of our lives. Marry me, be my wife, be Lily's mother. Build this empire with us." Vivian stared down at him, the tears freely falling now, ruining her expensive makeup. And she didn't care at all. She looked at the man who had stood by her, who had defended her against her enemies, and who loved her not for her billions, but for the woman she was behind closed doors. Yes, Vivian breathed, falling to her knees in front of him, pulling him into a fierce embrace. Yes, absolutely yes, contract voided. They held each other on the floor of the penthouse, the silence of the city buzzing far below them. They had started as a calculated equation, a desperate move on a corporate chessboard. But in the end, they had solved the most complex algorithm of all. They had found real, undeniable love, and no amount of money, power, or bitter exes could ever tear it down. Thank you so much for reading this incredible journey of revenge, redemption, and unexpected love. If Algernon and Vivian's story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our daily dose of thrilling, real-life drama stories. Drop a comment below, telling us what you would have done in Algernon's shoes at the reunion. See you in the next video.